Hello there, Bruce. This is the post for the reading February 8th in the 20 Lessons in Environmental Sociology, um, where we talk about a few different things. So the first chapter and question is about science and the nature of science. And in this chapter, York describes the difference between what he called the establishment of science and the logic of science. So some of the problems he brings up about the establishment of science, which he sees York, I think York is a he, Richard, he sees as a problem. He sees that the establishment of science can be problematic, and some of those problems he articulates on page 99, where he says, since science is pursued by humans, it is intrinsically a social phenomenon and thus cannot be seen as a free-floating institution disembodied from other human endeavors. He also says on page 100, a similar note, science and scientists cannot be seen as disinterested parties seeking truth for its own sake. And then he lays out on page 99 some examples that can come from this. He says, thus, it is necessary to recognize that the modern scientific establishment from its start was not aimed simply at the goal of understanding the world in which we live, but was intimately linked to existing power structures and typically focused on achieving ends dictated by the ruling class. So that's a really important part. And then he lays out different ways that structure, the fact that scientists from the ruling class have affected science. So he says, it is a matter of no small importance that so much of scientific effort has been directed at developing weapons. He goes on to explain that. Another substantial share of research effort is driven by raw financial interests, where corporations seek to increase profits by developing technologies of production and new products for the market without particular regard for human well-being, environmental sustainability, or the lives of other creatures, which this isn't a post, I'm not going to get into that, but that's really interesting to me, and I think that's really true. Actually, well, this is my question 3. I think that's super interesting, and I hadn't really thought of it that way, that most science, a lot of science, is dedicated to profit-increasing things. We talked about this a little bit in Medicine, Healing, and Culture with cancer, right? How, like, cancer research and there's all this stuff, all this money going into science for research and for researching cancer and researching cures, but there's not money going into preventing cancer because there's no money in that. You don't make a profit from preventing cancer, from stopping these chemicals being put in various things, from stopping environmental practices that release chemicals that, put these toxins in the air. Like, that's sort of the obvious cure to cancer, but it's not happening because it's not profitable. And there's not research and science going into more creative ways to stop these chemicals, because it's not profit seeking. So that's just one example, but I think when I read that I started thinking about, like, really so much of science, just even, I don't know, like we talked about in class with nuclear power, and then it just sort of gets into technology, all kinds of technology, lights, chair, like, I don't know, everything, researching different things, making up different things, innovating different things, how did these chemicals go together to create this thing, which seeks profit, as a profit, and we can go back to food, which we talk about later in the book, and the agricultural revolution with the technology chapter after this. But yep, that's my answer to question number 3. I thought that was really interesting. So another thing, back to question number 1, another problematic part of the research or the scientific establishment is a considerable amount of experimentation on non-human animals is done merely to develop new consumer goods, such as cosmetics, that causes much animal suffering and does little to enhance human quality of life for the sole purpose of generating greater profits for corporations. Similarly, the development of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, is to a large extent driven by the desire of large corporations to increase profits, since products stemming from genetic engineering, for example GM crops, pharmaceuticals, may potentially have vast markets. So that's an example of maybe in some ways one problem with the establishment is the inability to distinguish between, or just that science is social, and it's affected by people, and it's affected by the people that are doing it. It's affected by the privileges and limits they have, and that totally dictates what the science does, and how the science is done. Which actually goes to this quote exactly, where York says, although empirical evidence is the central part of answering questions about the natural world, data does not speak for themselves. Rather, what data are collected and how they are collected, analyzed, and interpreted are not independent of the social context of research, which is basically everything I was just saying. And then the other point I pulled from this chapter in answer to your question is on page 103, where he says, furthermore, it is increasingly the case that scientists have financial stakes beyond simply funding of their own research in the technologies they advocate, where he talks here about them more and more being involved in biotechnical industries and applications, and in government, and but working in companies to profit from the research they're doing, the science they're doing, which isn't just purely research. Again, going back to the quote about not just seeking truth for truth's sake. So that's answer question number 1, and they gave a tidbit about question number 3. And then for question number 2, which was about what are the problems of ecotourism? That's a good question, Bruce. Oh yeah, so they lay out a whole bunch of different problems that they see with ecotourism. They talk about who is a guide, who gets to be a guide, and who doesn't get to be a guide, and how that limits people and stratifies people in different classes even more, and perpetuates some of that stuff. So they talk about the program tour guide standardization and control has a big impact on who remains in guide work. A key limiting factor is literacy and access to formal education. The program therefore excludes many guides with extensive local environmental knowledge in favor of those with solid literacy but perhaps little local knowledge. The value of that indigenous knowledge has been decreased, while the value of formal academic skills has been increased. Again, sort of furthering these already built-in divides and perpetuating oppressive systems. This is all on page 345. They also talk about the problem of the fact that the number of people employed and economically sustained through ecotourism is often in direct relationship to the amount of environmental degradation caused by the enterprise. So the more successful the enterprise becomes, the more it degrades the environment. For example, larger scale operations are likely to provide more jobs, even though the increases are likely to be greatest at the lowest level of employment, rather than the higher levels. So another part of the answer to this question I guess, yeah. Although the eco and ecotourism often implies that tourism may be ecologically benign, even low-impact tourism brings new sets of ecological withdrawals in addition to intact ecosystems. Later on this page, this is 346, they say, nevertheless, the local level ecotourism does represent a primary and perhaps the singular ecological threat to wild nature in many parts of the world. So again, it sort of seems like a environmental thing, and they also talk about in here, in some cases, if the negative impact on the environment that they're working in is low enough and is enough to raise enough awareness about a certain issue, that can sometimes actually be a positive thing, for a positive ecological thing. But in most cases, it's not. And then they give a specific example on page 3047, where they talk about roads. As noted, infrastructure expansion is one of the most obvious ways that ecotourism disrupts the environmental system. Ecotourism needs roads, dwellings, toilets, and more. Local roads are necessary to take tourists to remote regions. And it goes on a little bit more about that. Yeah, I think that is sufficient. I also read about the technology bit in chapter 7. I thought that was interesting with agriculture and the Industrial Revolution. And let's see if I thought anything in particular was interesting. Labor surplus is something I've talked about in sociology before, and I think is an interesting and important concept. This highlighted the relationship with the Industrial Revolution and how that was a technological transformation of the relationship between social system and ecosystems. Yeah, that's what I got for you. That was kind of a long post. I apologize, but I hope you enjoyed it.